With something like masculinity, especially, guys had a really hard time defining it because they would be like, well, I know it when I see it, but if you can't articulate it, someone else will. And that's why I thought it was so important to talk about what masculinity is, what it isn't. And that doesn't mean that's all of it, but like, let's look at the little pieces of it and make sure that we're all talking on the same terms, because we are living in a world right now where people are like, well, what even is a man? Who's to say?
You're one of the guys out there so far that I'm looking at like, oh, he's actually doing masculinity a great service right now, where I see some other guys who are putting guys in kind of a path of masculinity that has led to this, I hate using the word toxic associated with it, but more of this negative style, I guess, of what I would say. And so anyways, I looked at the way I met and I was like, let me dive into this. And I really want to focus on that for a second, because that was kind of your entry level thing into the world, right? Like this is what birthed Jack Donovan to the masculine space. And, but you're really big on etymology, which I fucking love. Yeah. And I really respect highly. Why is that so important to you when you integrate your books and your teachings around your books? What is it about that gives you like pleasure and like letting guys know that?
Well, like your English teacher always taught you, like, mean what you say, like say exactly what you mean, and instead of, like look for the right word. And a lot of people just like to make up their own definitions of what words mean. And
very true. Especially
and that's
today.
Also a tactic. I have a lot of people use that as a propaganda tool. Like, we're going to change the meaning of this word for you. And then that changes the world, because that really, like, our world, the way men organize our world is by words. When we say this is a microphone, nothing else can be a microphone. And it's just this. And then we have to agree on that, or we have a problem. Like we aren't in the same reality anymore, So if you change it, you have to be really careful about what words mean. And so I think that's really important, because people are like, with something like masculinity, especially, guys had a really hard time defining it because they would be like, well, I know it when I see it. Or like, they'd have this visceral response, which is correct because we're animals. And we kind of judge each other on this level that we can't quite articulate. But if you can't articulate it, someone else will. And that's why I thought it was so important to talk about what masculinity is, what it isn't. And that doesn't mean that's all of it, but like, what's like, that's a whole masculine life. But like, let's look at the little pieces of it and make sure that we're all talking on the same terms, because I saw this coming, a long time ago, but we are living in a world right now where people are like, well, what even is a man? Who's to say? And that was, I read a lot of the literature. I mean, they were doing that in the 90s and the 2000s and so forth. There was a book called Masculinities, like Masculinities. There's so many different, so many different masculinities, right? And the thesis of that is basically that you can't define masculinity, so it can be whatever you want it to be, and therefore it's anything. And then, and that also means it can be everything, but then nothing at the same time. So then, that puts us in a really awkward situation that I think a lot of people are actually seeing now. Like, well, if we can't define it, then everybody else gets to make it up for us. So that it becomes a tricky thing,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I agree with you. I've read Masculinities as well. I've dove a lot into the sociological side of masculinity. I left a lot of the ancestral stuff out, which I love, but I haven't really included it as much into what my teachings have been. But with the sociological side, you're absolutely correct. It's like, well, yes, I get it. The definitions can be ambiguous if we look at, Merriam-Webster's definition of masculinity. And yes, there is a range of masculinities, but it can't just be anything. Right. And it can't be everything and nothing all at the same time. That doesn't make sense. Or else are we going to paint femininity the same way? Right.
Right. Well, that was the big project. That was the hard thing. And a really good friend of mine, when I was writing The Way of Men, he's a very analytical thinker. And so he's a like world-class book nerd. He actually like appraises books for a living. And he was like, well, if it is this, then it can't be this. We sat and did logic problems basically with masculinity. Is it always this or never this? What is it always? Yeah. But and things like that. And that's kind of how I came up with my theory of what masculinity is. And and a lot of people like to misunderstand that and read it too quickly, because I make a point about being kind of an amoral thing. Like masculinity can be good or bad. It's kind of like a gun. You can be used for anything, but that doesn't mean that you're supposed to be bad. That doesn't mean that you're supposed to be a bad guy. It just means that like, let's talk about this thing. And it also the problem, one of the logic problems is, well, if it really doesn't have anything to do specifically with masculinity, then it's just part of being human. But if it's something that like, no one cares if women do it, but people care if men do it, then it's like, then that's a masculinity thing. It's in the category, it's like, like strength is one of those things. Like women can be very strong. Women can be very strong. But they don't have to be. I mean, like they don't have to. Like people value them for other things. But men, if you're weak, people are like, "What's up with you, dude? What's your problem?"
It's true.
So it's just finding those little details and like, what's the logic problem involved in it?
Yeah, I think there's, especially with strength, that's a great one you bring up because I think there is. So this is where I think a really cool conversation can happen between you and I, because traditional masculinity, this was something I posted on recently, and people wanted me and you to fight this thing out. So, but no, I looked at this and I said, okay, well, traditional masculinity, if we're going to give a term traditional masculinity, it's got to have a definition of certain traits, right? And so I would love to dive into that with you. Like, do you have an idea of what that looks like? Because you've done a lot of research in this field. So I'm open to this conversation because I think it's great for us to have it.
Well, I don't use traditional masculinity because that implies that there are other kinds. Because that opens up the way they started using traditional masculinity. Again, that comes from the far left, and that comes from the masculinities. That's traditional masculinity. That's just one kind of masculinity. And a woman has a different kind of. And I'm like, wait, now. It goes a different way. And so when I talk about masculinity, I'm talking about like basic things that are kind of hardwired into men across cultures. There's so many, and that was one of the things that's right about that book is that, and many people who have said the same things before that, obviously there are huge cross-cultural differences between groups of men. Yeah. In fact, that's one of the features of masculinity is that we're tribal and we want to self-determine. So we will actually differentiate ourselves. We will do we do this different thing. You don't do it. And so we'll separate ourselves and distinguish ourselves by doing something different. So it's like you can have, but if you look at it the wrong way, if you look at the one way, you see men doing the same thing, but with different like costumes and whatever. Like, okay, well, you could say that in Scotland they wear skirts, but they're not trying to be women. That's their warrior uniform. They're doing the same thing. Like it's not. And so it's like you can focus on those little cultural details and get kind of derailed, but. Like I always say with strength, it's one of those things like at what mainstream culture in the world, because you always have priests and like monks and things like that, but they're outside the mainstream always. What mainstream culture have you said like, that guy who's the weakest guy in the room, he is the most masculine guy, or that, like that's just nowhere in all of history. Strength is just universally kind of associated with masculinity. And the same thing with courage. Like courage is, that coward over there. He is the most masculine man I know. No one says that. No, I don't care if you're the guy what continent of the earth. Yeah, I mean it's just not associated. Whereas like women can be very courageous, but they're not like, well, you're not a woman if you're not courageous. So it's one of those defining features. And so and that's why it's very simple. It's like, and my idea where I got all this from is like, well, what have men needed to do everywhere? Like for most of our evolutionary history, we've all had the same job, like basically like, oh, we have to do what the military does, like go into a place, set up a perimeter, set up a safe space, guard it, and depend on these bunch of guys. And that's why I like a lot of special forces guys like really like my books because they're like, yep, that's exactly what we do. And so you go into that place and do that thing. And our, I think, baseline assessment of what masculinity is as a species comes from that job that we've always had to do. Now, is that all of masculinity? I mean, is that the only thing that men can ever do? No, man, I went to art school. Like I'm a writer. I'm not even good at that job. And that's one of the things that I think distinguishes the way of men from, I think, a lot of other books is that it wasn't like, hey, be more like me. Yeah. It wasn't like, hey guys, I'm the most masculine guy and you should actually be exactly like me. I'm your hero. Yeah. I was like, well, what is this thing that we're talking about? Is all the book was about, and not like be like me. So it's like I can acknowledge what masculinity is, and then you see all these guys on a spectrum. My old friend Greg Hamilton used to do war reenactment groups and so forth, and he was a soldier before that, and he took him forever because he was kind of one of the pipe hitter kind of guys, and it took him forever to realize that there were some dudes who just wanted to be the cook. Mm-hmm. They wanted to be on the team, but they wanted to be the cook. And I always thought that was a really great realization. It took him forever because he thought that everyone wanted to be him. Everyone wanted to be the like badass guy, but some guys just want to be on the team and be the cook. And that's part of the whole spectrum of what we're doing. But the core of what masculinity still stays the same. So, but there's this whole range of expression within it. But like that baseline is still there.
Yeah. So in Fire in the Dark, you talk about this, and I loved how you put it in there. And that's where I'm like, okay, this is really a cool, because you're talking about how civilization, especially when the Romans kind of created that civilization, it really took masculinity in that more expanded direction because they didn't have to just survive anymore, right? Yeah. And so but your underlying premise is that the core still remains the same. While the complexity on top of masculinity may have been overlaid, the cores are still there in transfer from generations, right? Yeah.
When we have more civilization, like at first, I always like this. There's a quote from Han from Enter the Dragon. Like think of all the things that have perished because they didn't have the strength to survive. Like all the beautiful things and it's true. Civilizations rise and fall, and if they weren't defended properly, they go away. Sure. And they're just ruins, or they get wiped off the face of the earth completely. But as a civilization, if they have that perimeter handled, like say Rome, or like any other America, if they have the perimeter, well, for not really right now, but if they have the perimeter, it theoretically handled. If that job's handled, then men can afford to specialize within it and do all these other jobs, and you can have butchers and bakers and cobblers and all these other things that you would need to have a nice society, and to be philosophers, because, no one has this time to philosophize if you can't survive. Men create the space for us to do that stuff, we have that outer ring. And then, once that's established, then we can do all those other things, and then we can specialize and explore all the other parts of being men. Because people always say that like men aren't creative, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Men literally built almost everything beautiful in the world up until very recently. It's all every beautiful building, everything that men were like, I want to do that. And so there's such a range of what we can do. Once we've gotten that those important things handled. But I think men are also especially aware of that reality of like, well, we don't trust other men necessarily because we know how we are. Yeah. and we,
it's very true.
And that's why I think, sometimes we're a little bit more suspicious when it comes to voting and all these other kind of things. We're like, I don't really trust that guy. Yeah. And I think that he might be corrupt and he might do some things because maybe I would be in that position. You don't know, and so I think we're very aware of the tactical issues surrounding like keeping a society alive or keeping a family alive or all those things. Whereas, I think women, not all, but, because nothing's always, the same, but I think women sometimes aren't as aware of like situational awareness and like security and things like that, whereas men tend to think about that first, sometimes at the expense of a lot of other things. There are a lot of guys who only think about warrior stuff. And then, then they really have nothing else going on, in their lives. Yeah. And that's a problem too, it's, I find a lot of those guys who actually do the warrior job, then come back and they need to like do mushrooms and do gardening or something like that. They need to chill out,
100%. I was that guy. I mean, I was in spec ops and then I did protection for years. And I came back, I was judgmental. I was on alert all the fucking time. Like even now, like I do it a little more subdued, but I'm more consciously aware, like, bro, kick the fuck back. Like you got to relax a little bit. Yeah. And so my wife knows that. And that's been something that I've had to work on coming back from overseas, spending like a decade in and out of the Middle East. So like that was a life that I knew very well. And you're right, man. It's to separate from that, there's got to be some modality we connect with that brings us back into that essence of like, and you put this again really well in Fire in the Dark. You talk about how the striker, when he comes back, right, when he's done with the chaos, has to kind of reside back into that peace and order, right? And that's kind of what I felt like. That really resonated with me when you talked about that.
Yeah, and I talked about it too in actually The Way of Men, and we just revisited this in my group recently because we go through a lot of these old books, and the oldest story in the world, Epic of Gilgamesh. There's a part, and I just talked about this recently on a different podcast, that there's a part where, Gilgamesh, the whole story of it is he's this awesome king who slayed their monster and the bull of heaven, and then his friend dies, and he's like, I'm gonna die. That's not cool. And he goes on this quest to find eternal life. And, he's basically denied. They're like, that's not going to happen. The gods are like, no, you don't get to do that. But he meets this woman who makes wine, and she sits down and has a talk with him. And she's like, yes, you're going to die. And yes, you've been concerned with all these other things, but, take time to enjoy the baby in your arms and a nice glass of wine and all the nice things that go with all the things that you can enjoy about being alive. And she's like, this too is the lot of men. And so I think that's what a lot of those guys need to oh, I get to do this too. I get to have this, these other parts of life that are actually beautiful and good. And that's part of what being a man has always been about as well,